Hi, Brian Dempsey here, and wanted to make a quick video to address a couple of things that came up in a discussion on Facebook about reading and becoming a better reader. And so as we kind of went through this thread online, we were sharing some tips and ideas about how to improve our reading comprehension. And so I thought I would share a few things that I do, and maybe this will be a help to you. Number one, when you read a book, and by the way, we will title this video 10 Tips to Improve Your Reading Comprehension. And so number one is from Benjamin Franklin himself, and what he said was never read a book without a pen in your hand. And so, boy, I take that to heart. I hardly walk to a mailbox without having a book and a pen. And so if you have a pen in your hand, no matter what you're reading, you have the opportunity to underline, highlight. Personally, I like to scribble, circle, argue with the author. If you read in the columns of my book, sometimes I'll write, boy, that's a great point, or you're a blooming idiot, or whatever. But I really interact with the author as I write in books. And some people, I know it makes their skin crawl to just think of writing in a book. But if you want to improve your reading comprehension, the very first thing that I would do is take Benjamin Franklin's advice and never read a book without a pen in your hand. Another thing, when we're talking about reading comprehension, number two is read a whole paragraph or a whole section before you go to highlight or underline something. I know sometimes I kind of get ahead of myself and I'll be reading through a book, and most of the kinds of books that I read are not, they're not novels, they're not fiction books, and so they're a little bit more technical or oriented for study. So sometimes we will begin reading, and the very first line that you see that's interesting, you'll want to highlight that. And what I found is if you read the entire paragraph first, a lot of times there may be a summary statement, or there may be a little better information for you to highlight down in the paragraph rather than just breaking up your train of thought. So you may want to read a whole section first and then go back and find what you want to highlight, and I think that'll help with some reading comprehension. Another thing that I do, in fact I do it a lot, is I read out loud. And if you read out loud, you will read more slowly than if you read silently. But there are times where by reading out loud, by reading with inflection, you're able to have more senses engaged in what you're reading. So you're not just seeing it, but you're also hearing what you're reading, and that simply helps with reading comprehension as well. And by the way, I read a study just today about reading out loud, and the study gave some great insights. One of the things that it mentioned was if people read a list, like a list of items, and one of those items was different than the rest. Maybe there was a list of 10 things, and it was 10 kinds of birds, and 9 kinds of birds, and one was a sport. People would tend to remember the sport and they would forget the other 9. And so what it shows us is those things that stand out, those things that are somehow different, tend to make more of an impression in our brains. So a lot of times what I'll do is if I'm reading and I come across a paragraph that is just really solid, something I really want to get, I'll stop and I'll read that out loud, and it really helps to set it apart in my thinking. So there are times where you can read out loud. So never read a book without a pen in your hand. Read a whole paragraph or section before you go through and highlight or underline. At times, read out loud, and then also read silently. If we're going to read out loud sometimes we want to read silently. And I would encourage you, if you do this, when we're talking about reading comprehension, read with a pencil, read with a pen, and simply check. As you see something that stands out, you see something interesting, simply put a little check in the margin, and that way you can keep reading. This gives you the big picture of a book, and then you can go back through and look and pay attention later to some of the things that you checked. But that will help improve your comprehension. This next one, I think, is something a lot of people just don't do. And when you're reading to study, when you're reading and it's something that you really want to comprehend, it's not just enjoyment. Something that I do often, in fact, it probably makes me look pretty silly for somebody looking in my office, or maybe if I'm driving down the road, but if I read something, I'll stop at the end of the paragraph or at the end of the section, and I'll think through it in my mind, and sometimes I'll even talk through it out loud as if I'm explaining what I've read to someone. If you can formulate your thinking enough to be able to communicate that to someone else, then it's just going to increase your comprehension. And if you do that throughout the book, if you do that throughout your study, it's going to help significantly. So never read a book without a pen in your hand. Read the whole paragraph first. At times read out loud. Other times read silently and simply check things that are important. Explain what you read. And then this comes from a chapter in a book that I'm going to recommend here in just a moment, but learn to x-ray a book. When we're talking about reading comprehension, recognize that it's okay not to read the entire book. In fact, there are lots of books that I buy that I skim through the table of contents, and I look at the things that are going to be important to me, especially if it's a compilation, and I pick and choose the sections of the book that I'm going to read. And it took me a while to not feel guilty about not reading the whole book and only reading parts of it. But by doing that, by being more selective, I was able to benefit much more than if I simply labored through some things that presented information that at the time I just wasn't interested in. So learn to pay attention to the table of contents and really pick out the areas that you want to read. Also, something that I tend to do is pay attention to summary words. And summary words are things like therefore, or as a result, or in conclusion. And make sure that when you see that, you are able in your mind to know what his argument was, what the author's argument was before he got to a summary. Because if you see a summary word and you don't understand the previous argument, then you're not really comprehending that. So I usually mark those kind of summary words. I'll underline them, and I'll go back and make sure that I know what the points are that are leading up to the author's conclusion. And sometimes we find that he's made some kind of logical fallacy, and really the points that he's brought forth can lead to other conclusions, or maybe it's simply not conclusive. Also, something that I would encourage you to do is use highlighters or circle and underline key phrases in a book. I'll tell you, I do that. Here's an example of a book that I read just this past week, and you can see that, boy, I highlight, and then, I was reading, and this particular book is on pluralism. And so right here is the word tolerance, and then I will underline the key phrases or the key words within a sentence, and that really helps to stand out. And it also helps when I highlight and I underline. When I finish a book, before I simply put it down and move on to the next thing, I typically pick it back up and go page for page and just flip back through it, and I will read what I've highlighted. I just don't understand folks personally who can read a book and they don't mark in it, they don't write in it, and then, maybe the one key thought or maybe one thing that really stood out, it's simply lost in their 200 or 300 or 400 page book, and they can't open it up and go back and find that. And so I would encourage you, use a highlighter and a pen. Also, when it comes to reading comprehension, mark words that you don't know. This is something that is going to help increase your vocabulary. I recently read just an absolutely outstanding book called The Professor and the Madman. And if you can see the subtitle here, the subtitle is A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary. So it is a book about the making of a dictionary. So I wasn't too surprised when there were 35 or 40 words in the first, however many chapters of this book that I didn't know. But I went through and circled every single solitary word that I didn't know. And when I was done, because this is not on a Kindle, I simply went to dictionary.com and spent a little bit of time and looked up some of these words and have added a couple of them to my vocabulary. A few of these are a little archaic, but anyway, fantastic thing to do. Circle words that you don't know. Finally, the last tip is read this book, How to Read a Book, and by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. Absolutely outstanding. And one of the things that this does is it helps you to be able to read multiple works and to compare them. It has the tip about x-raying a book and kind of understanding the author's purpose and goal, and being able to evaluate a book to see if it's something that you want to read to begin with. So let's just review those 10 tips real quick, because I didn't number them throughout. Number 1, never read a book without a pen in your hand. Number 2, read a whole paragraph before you go through and highlight or underline anything, and that way you get the bigger context and sometimes can find the conclusions. At times when you need to read out loud, you'll read more slowly, but it will help you to remember that as you engage your senses. Also, read silently, and as you read silently, simply use a pencil and just check key paragraphs that you want to go back and read later. Explain what you read. Learn to x-ray a book and realize that you don't have to read every single chapter. Pay attention to summary words, therefore, as a result, in conclusion. Circle and underline key words and phrases in a sentence or in a paragraph. Mark words that you don't know and look them up. Again, if you have a key, all you gotta do is double click and it pops up the dictionary there. And then finally, read How to Read a Book. I hope these tips are helpful to you, and happy reading.